Emma and Tom Talk Teaching, a podcast about all things education, presented by Emma O'Dooher and Tom Breeze. Episode 13, Trauma-Informed Practice with Dr Anne Hodgson.
Hello and welcome back to Emma and Tom Talk Teaching, and we've got a guest with us who joined us for the first time last season, and we've been lucky enough to get her back for another episode. Dr Anne Hodgson, how are you doing?
I'm okay, thank you.
Welcome back to our podcast.
I must be crazy.
It's a good sign when they come back. It means we must be nice.
And we had a cracking episode from you last season looking at additional learning needs, practice, policy, legislation. It went down really well.
We crammed a lot in.
We did. We ranged far and wide. I've got a funny feeling that this episode might do the same. So we're going to sort of set the landscape first. You're here to talk about trauma-informed practice, trauma-informed schools. But before we do that, I think we need to sort of talk about the wider landscape. We hear a lot now about adverse childhood experiences, ACEs. You know quite a bit about where this came from. Started out in America, I understand. So maybe we just need to sort of paint a picture of ACEs, where that research has come from, why it's important to education, before we then move into talking about trauma-informed practice.
No problem. Okay, so whistle-stop tour of the history of ACEs. Basically, there were two researchers in America doing big projects, completely separate, not related to each other at all, Felitti and Andes. And one of them was looking at the impact of, I think his focus was obesity, but the impact of adversity in early childhood on later obesity and health problems. And then the other was looking at mental health and the impact of adversity in childhood on mental health in later life. And then they kind of, I don't know how they met, I can't remember how they met, but they kind of came across each other's research and realised that they were looking at the same thing and kind of joined together. And they undertook the first, what's now called ACEs study. There's now been ACEs studies all over the world in most Western countries. So the ACEs study, basically, it looked at, I think it was about 75,000 or 65,000 adult Americans, and it did a survey of their mental and physical health alongside their early childhood experiences, and found incredibly clear links between the two. And not just like, there's a little bit more of a likelihood that you might get this, that and the other if you've had these difficult childhood experiences. I mean, like, really clear data correlations between the number of adverse childhood experiences somebody has had with how many more times likely they are to develop things like, not just things like depression and alcohol and drug dependencies, but also things like heart disease, cancer, diabetes, like actual physical health complaints, which prior to that study, really, we'd held in really separate boxes. We'd said, oh, well, these experiences are obviously impacting on people's well-being and mental health, and therefore we can totally understand that they'll impact on people's well-being and mental health. But we'd never really seen any strong evidence that it was directly correlated to physical health as well. And so that just, took the medical, social care, education, the implications of those links go across the whole of society. And I think that's one of the things we'll probably keep coming back to all the way through this podcast, is that understanding ACEs and understanding the impact of trauma is not an education thing. This is not about something that we need to understand in education because we need to remedy it. This is a societal issue, and this is something that can only be addressed wholly with changes across the whole of our society. And we have a part to play in that. We're one piece of that jigsaw puzzle as educators, but it's definitely not all, in our camp.
And I suppose it just occurred to me actually a little bit late in the day that we ought to have started off this episode with a bit of a trigger warning. Some of the things that we are going to be talking about in this episode are uncomfortable, but they are the reality, unfortunately, of a lot of the young people that we work with, their parents, their carers, society, as you said, as a whole. So I think what we might need to know, and it's good that I've done that trigger warning, is what are we talking about when we're talking about these adverse childhood experiences that have got this longer term, this awful impact on longer term health and well-being? What are we talking about? Because from my knowledge, and I remember we had a session on this, if you had a certain amount, because they did a big survey, didn't they, of these adults, and if you had a certain number of them, it was about levels of toxicity in your body that sort of had this sort of negative, and a little bit of knowledge is a terrible thing. So put me right, Anne.
Well, and I feel exactly the same in terms of the little bit of knowledge, because I've done training on ACEs, I've done a trauma-informed diploma, I've studied it. It was part of my previous role. But even then, the neuroscience behind this is so huge that when you delve into this topic and you start reading around it, you can very quickly find yourself out of your depth. You can very quickly find yourself in neuroscience speak, brain development speak, talking about different zones of the brain, nucleus accumbens and all that sort of stuff, and just go, I don't understand, and run away. Or certainly that's what I do. And yeah, absolutely. The thing with ACEs is the research shows that it's an accumulative effect in terms of the number of adverse experiences somebody has that lead to the likelihood of. Now, you've got to remember with all of this that this is just can lead to. This is not if somebody has had adverse childhood experiences, they are doomed to these, much more negative outcomes. It's not a given. When you look at ACEs and trauma-informed, you have to also, alongside that, look at the research on resilience and what are our protective factors, because there are lots of people who've had significant adverse childhood experiences who haven't gone on to develop significant mental health issues or major physical health problems in later life because they've had some, resilient protective factors. Usually, we'll probably talk about this again later, but usually a consistent, emotionally available caregiver is one of the key things that help children be resilient. But yeah, adverse childhood experiences, we're talking about, I'm not going to remember them all, physical, emotional and sexual abuse, physical and emotional neglect, domestic violence, parental mental health, parental substance misuse, parental imprisonment, so like an absent parent, and parental separation. And then they were the original study collection. Since that time, because there's been a number of iterations of the ACEs studies, as I said, in many different countries, and there's people have made the case for other factors to be added as well, such as bereavement, poverty, homelessness, that there are other strands of experience that could be classed as being in this bracket. So it's not a definite, finite, number of items, and that's all that counts. Significant discrimination is another one that could be added in there. There's lots of strands that could be added into that, and it's, as you say, it's about toxicity. It's about living with toxic stress. So trauma in and of itself is not the event. Trauma is our response to the event in the absence of protective factors, people, relationships to help us cope with what's gone on. So it's not an absolute given that if these things happen, these will be your outcomes. You've got to take into account those things that, balance it out.
And you did say very clearly, just before any of our student teachers or new teachers sort of run screaming from this, we're not trying to fix this issue, but to be, I guess, informed by it. The name, I guess the clue's kind of in the name, trauma informed. What do we actually mean then by being trauma informed? Is it just knowing that, or is there more to it than that?
Well, I mean, there's different levels of being trauma informed. And I guess depending on somebody's interest, passion, it's like anything, isn't it? I mean, if we think about additional learning needs, additional learning needs is and should be everybody's business, but everybody will vary in the level of interest they have in it. Some people will start out at the very early stages of their career being really passionate about additional learning needs. I went into teaching already knowing I wanted to work with people with autism. That was already like my thing. So some people will go into teaching already passionate about it, and so will make sure that they're informed and they understand and they, have a real depth of knowledge. Others will go into teaching and then realise that they're really interested in additional learning needs and learn more about it and find out more. Others will go through their teaching career knowing as much as they need to get by in the classroom. It won't be a passion, it won't be a thing, it won't be something they seek out proactively. They'll do the training that schools have on as mandatory, and they'll put into place what they have to put into place, and that will be as far as it goes. And it's the same for ACEs, and trauma. Like, ideally, everybody would understand what we mean by these things, understand the impact that trauma and adverse childhood experiences can have on the brain and physical development of children, and have an idea about the sorts of things that they can do in their classroom to help to mitigate some of that and put it into practice. But in reality, lots of teachers won't have that knowledge and won't have those skills. I think I said waving my magic wand in the last podcast, but if I could wave my magic wand, I would make all practitioners understand what this means. The statistics around adverse childhood experiences in Wales are really quite stark. The percentage of people in Wales from the original ACEs survey in Wales that have 4 or more ACEs was significantly higher than the American percentage for 4 or more ACEs. So we really should be concerned about the experiences our children are having outside of school and what we can do to help support them in school.
And as you were talking there, I was starting to think about data, because we know that is one thing, one sort of stream of information, knowledge that schools draw upon to inform their practice. And I wondered, what kind of data would a school get about ACEs? And would that dictate whether they became trauma informed? You're shaking your head. So I'm just wondering, should all schools have trauma informed practice, a culture of that? Should this be everybody's business, or are there certain types of school in certain areas, without wanting to generalize? I'm just wondering, where does a school start with this? How do they know when this is their business or not?
I think so. Public Health Wales started a campaign, I can't even remember how many years ago it was now. It might be maybe about 6 or 7, but that's a bit of a guesstimate. But when the ACEs stuff all started becoming really big news and came over to the UK, and England did their study, Wales did their study, Public Health Wales pulled together a team to really invest in adverse childhood experiences training in Wales. And they funded, for a number of years, they had a whole team that were funded to deliver ACEs training. So they trained trainers, which is the version I went to. So representatives from schools and local authorities across Wales went and received the training to deliver the training. And then the expectation was that they would all deliver the training out into their schools and cascade that. So there was a real big push and drive to get the information about, what are the statistics in Wales in general, statistics, and why should we be interested? Why should we care? And what can we do about it? And yeah, that was a huge push, and the health boards were all on board. There's a movie called, I don't know if you've seen it, called Resilience. Have you seen that?
It might have been used in, because I remember very, very clearly having that professional learning here at Cardiff Met, and that might have been part. I remember watching some very powerful video footage of it, so perhaps it was from that.
Well, so it's like a full-length movie called Resilience, and it kind of focuses on the work of Nadine Harris, Dr. Nadine Harris. So she was a paediatrician, Harvard graduate paediatrician in America, and she's working in a community, and she set up I think it was a really deprived part of San Francisco, I think the most deprived part of San Francisco, and they'd set up a family and child support clinic, and she was working from there, really trying to impact on all of the challenges and difficulties. And then she came across that ACEs paper that Felitti and Anders had published. And that was, I think, in 2008. And she then started this big movement around ACEs, and she linked with them, and it became a government-led thing. And they introduced in their centres, in their medical centres, a survey. So from the minute a woman was pregnant, basically the minute they got contact with a woman, whether or not she was, carrying the baby, or she just had the baby, or they were a toddler, teenager, whatever, they gave them an ACEs survey. They didn't ask them to indicate which ACEs. They just asked them to read the list and to indicate a number of how many ACEs they had experienced, and and if the child was born, how many ACEs they think the child had experienced. And they had a whole raft of medics and social workers, and they would do family visits, and they would do therapy interventions, and they'd do all this raft of work to try and undo the toxic implications through that big, multi-agency, cross-service approach. That hasn't travelled, funnily enough. So the research travelled, but that model didn't travel. And obviously for many reasons related to policy and funding. And so when it comes to our schools, they don't have any means of knowing how many children they have in their care that have experienced, adverse conditions, experiences in their childhood. They don't have any way of knowing it, nor would it be right to ask. It's incredibly personal information. But from the statistics, from the study of the adults in Wales, we know that I think it's just under half, I think it's about 47% or something, of people in Wales have experienced at least one. And then the 4 or more, which is when you go up into the realms of significant impacts later on in life, I think is something like 14%. So 14 in every 100 children, at least, because that's just from the survey who was willing to say. You can imagine that there was likely people who responded to that survey who didn't feel able to be fully open. Maybe they haven't yet been fully open with themselves about some of the experiences they had when they were children. So at least 14 in every 100 children from the statistics we've got in Wales. So that does tell, and that's the significant end, that's the 4 or more. So that does tell us that this should be everybody's business, and everybody should be invested in understanding what it means, understanding how it impacts, and more importantly, understanding what they can do about it.
Thinking about our lovely listeners now some of them might be, we flatter ourselves, there might be some quite high-powered people listening. You've got things like budgets and strategies and people that can tell what to do.
I don't think anybody's got budgets at the minute.
No, I strike the budget bit from the record, but the other things.
Yeah.
Quite a lot of them are going to be new members of the profession, single teachers in single classrooms, and they're going to be saying, all right, I'm convinced, I get it, this is a bad thing, this is having a bad outcome on my kids, it would be lovely if I could do something about it. However, I've got, things to deliver and targets to meet and results to get, or whatever it may be. So I suppose for that person who is in that quite limited context without a huge amount of power, but they want to do something, what can they do? And what is the knock-on effect of doing it? Is this going to be just a thing? I say just. Is this going to be a thing that is going to make happier, healthier children? Or is it going to have academic outcomes? What's the kind of story for that person at the bottom of the heap?
Happier, healthy children or academic outcomes?
I know, but, there will be people. There will be people kind of asking these questions.
Well, I mean, first of all, we know that not only do these experiences and living with the impact of toxic stress, not only do they impact on mental health and physical health, but they also impact on education outcomes, attendance, behaviour problems, focus, all sorts of things that filter into the school environment. So there's definitely motivation there from those who are outcome, focused. There's reason to invest. And then the other thing I would say, when you were saying about, because I totally agree with you in terms of lots of people will be thinking, well, I haven't got any power to change any of this in my one classroom with my... but actually, when it comes to these children with these experiences in life, actually that is all the power. That is where the power sits, with that one adult who is in a position to forge a relationship and make a difference. And have you seen that? You've got to have seen that video with Ian Wright when he... Yeah. I mean, they use that on the trauma-informed training because it's an example of a child who had many, many difficult experiences and found school very challenging and didn't feel very valued. And that one teacher gave him that time and that investment and made him feel listened to and worthwhile. And he still, however old he was in that video, like 50 or whatever, was still carrying that, huge emotional response with him everywhere because of what that one teacher had given him. So in terms of individual teachers, they do hold all the power when it comes to the response to ACEs, because the main thing that makes a difference for children who have had these very difficult life experiences are those relationships. It is having adults who, they use the phrase an emotionally available adult, and all we mean by that is somebody who genuinely cares about the child as a person, not as a pupil in the classroom, as a human being, and takes the time to ask them how they're doing and listen to them and find out what's going on in their life and greets them warmly each day, despite what might have happened yesterday if things had unravelled and they'd completely dysregulated and trashed a classroom, that they still get a nice, warm, good morning, really lovely to see you, how are you doing today, So those sorts of strategies, it's really about creating an ethos in your classroom of like warmth and acceptance and care. School is often, for a lot of children, the only stable thing that they have going on, especially, if home life is really, really difficult and fractious, if they've got parents with mental health issues or substance misuse, or they're living in food poverty, or, whatever's going on at home, school often provides that pocket of safety and stability. And if we can add to that and make it feel really caring and warm and make them feel cared for, then that's a huge step towards helping them to regulate, helping them to calm those stress hormones down that have been kicking off all the time in their day-to-day lives. So all of that really helps. It really adds to it.
Yeah, it's got me reflecting now. We've started to get into sort of the nitty-gritty of what that practice looks like. I remember when we interviewed you for the episode on additional learning needs, something that you said quite powerfully was that really good pedagogy is like your first principles, your first, this is not the right way to put it, but sort of your first line of defence in supporting, making sure your practice is inclusive. So what I want to know is that would you be able to tell the difference, and I'm saying this with a few caveats because we don't want just point-at-able things in classrooms, but would you be able to tell the difference if you spent the day in a classroom working or observing a practitioner who had gone through this trauma-informed professional learning versus somebody that hadn't? Would you be able to sort of see the difference in practice, and what would you see if so?
It would depend on how much. So, for example, the trauma-informed schools, which is one package, there's lots of different, there's Thrive, there's all sorts of different packages about approaching children and young people who've experienced trauma or adverse childhood experiences. And they all have some threads of continuity, and they all have some models that are specific to their approach. And depending on how much someone was adhering to the training would depend on how clearly I would be able to spot if they'd done the training. So, for example, one of the things on the trauma-informed schools training is the WINE model. So, I wonder, I imagine, I notice, and then empathy. Yeah. So it's a model for how we meet children when they're starting to dysregulate, and we meet them with curiosity, and we meet them with nothing that's confrontational. So I wonder if that made you feel da-da-da-da-da. I noticed that you said that to such and such, and I wondered if da-da-da. So it's coming at things from that kind of curiosity and always with empathy. Those sorts of phrases, if I saw somebody in practice saying, I wonder, I notice, I imagine, I would be like, oh yeah, they've done the trauma training. But I think through all of the different packages, the clearest message to all is empathy. And I think if you went into a practitioner's classroom where there was real genuine connection with the pupils and real care and time was given to listen to them, and people were being empathetic in their responses and in their listening, would I know if they were trauma-informed, or would I just think they were an excellent practitioner who just got children and just understood the needs of children and young people? I think certainly it's probably a bit more obvious at a secondary level, because at a primary level we kind of expect that, and we've got a bit more time and space for that, haven't we, when we've got one class with us all of the time and we can really develop those rich relationships. It's more challenging at a secondary level, and so I think it would be more obvious at a secondary level if somebody was prioritising taking those little pockets of time out to just have those little dialogues with students, and in that sort of kind of open way. I think maybe it would be a little bit more obvious. But
I'm thinking about a new member of the profession now, perhaps hasn't clocked up a lot of hours in a school environment, perhaps quite inexperienced. They might be listening to this and they might have one of two reactions. They might be thinking, that sounds absolutely terrifying. I did not sign up for this. I don't want to get this close to my pupils. I just want to teach X, Y, Z. I mean, I think probably this thing you were saying about secondary, you could imagine that. I just want to teach. my subject. I don't want to, I can't cope with this. I'm terrified of it. At the other extreme, you might get a new member of the profession who's like, I'm all up for this, goes in and potentially crosses all sorts of lines and gets himself in a terrible state as well. You know, you could imagine through inexperience taking one or other of those kind of extreme routes into trouble. Do you have advice, guidelines, ways of kind of allaying that from happening?
Is it too harsh to say use of common sense?
No.
No, I mean, and I totally understand where you're coming from, and there will inevitably be, as I said before, even when we think about additional learning needs, you know, same thing. There will be people going into the profession who are like, whoa, I don't know what I'm doing here. I feel out of my depth, you know, with kids with additional needs. That bit, I mean, actually, they're both just as harmful, really, potentially.
Yeah, that's why I didn't pick one. That's why I picked them both.
Yeah, I think they both have as potentially harmful outcomes as one another, really. I think with the kind of booling in and stepping over certain boundaries, I mean, you know, we expect that all practitioners going into the classroom have had like safeguarding training, etc. They all know the sorts of conversations not to have and to have. You know, we're taught right from the start that we don't go in and ask a child for personal details. We don't, you know, have conversations with them with leading questions. Your job is not to find out what their adverse experiences are. Your job is not to sit down and dig in with them into what goes on when you go home at night and why are you so angry. That is not the role of the general classroom practitioner. That's somebody's role, often not provided in our current systems, but we won't necessarily go there. Your job is to be consistent, be their teacher, be their care, be consistent in your classroom with, very similar to the ALN stuff, with the structure and routines of your classroom, with, like, as I said before, the importance of warm greetings at transition points. So that's not just start and end of the day. This is particularly important in high school. That's leaving lessons and arriving at lessons. You know, that those transition points are just as important. Just making those environments as predictable and safe and caring as we can. That's your role as a classroom practitioner.
I suppose we should also explore the flip side of that as well, isn't it? That they shouldn't be digging into what's going on in the kids' life in great and unnecessary detail, but they also shouldn't necessarily be going in as a, look at my sob story. I've had a sob story too, and I'm going to make this my thing, that we're going to kind of, you know, do this together. Yeah,
absolutely not. Yeah. Definitely not. So again, in the same way as the messages we're told when we do safeguarding training, we're definitely not standing in a classroom with children or even on a one-on-one, which is probably when it's more tempting to do this, trying to show them that you empathise because you've had those experiences as well, or you've had similar experiences, that we're not going there either.
That's not emotionally available. That's not what we mean.
No, absolutely not. That's not going to help. You can absolutely give the messages that I really understand. You know, oh, that must have been, if a young person's sharing something with you, I understand that must have been really difficult, or that must have been really scary. I imagine that was a really difficult time for you. You can really empathise and listen and be, you know, actively listen and be there. But yeah, we're not sharing our own life experiences. That doesn't help the child or young person. That's not emotionally available.
Yeah, I did wonder about that term, emotionally available, because I'm sure that in the training, maybe there's a lot of sort of time given to defining the boundaries of that. But I also wondered about senior leadership in schools and what sort of broader support mechanisms there need to be to support staff? Because I can imagine, it's all very well and good being emotionally available, but you might hear some really difficult things. And you can't, it's about time as well. Gosh, we'd love to be emotionally available for a lot of the time, but we've only have so much time. So what does a trauma-informed school look like then? What kind of structures, systems and support, collaboration, what needs to be in place to make that work?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right. I think, we can't talk about ACEs and the implications of ACEs without acknowledging that the research, the stats around ACEs are based on our adult population. They're based on our workforces. Yeah. When in the Resilience movie, when you see, I don't know if it's Andes or Folletti, but one of the two original researchers is hosting these big events with different professional groups, and part of what they do in the event is they get them all to fill in the survey. And then they stick their stats up on the screen. And actually the social care and education professionals, social care particularly, but they were the ones with the highest, of most of the professional groups that they'd spoken to. So yeah, we have to understand that all of these things we're talking about are just as relevant to our workforce as they are to our children. We can't suggest that we're a trauma-informed school if actually, from a working perspective, it's a really toxic environment and staff feel, really overworked and under huge pressure and feel really powerless and, all of these things that make those very difficult work environments. So, there are like frameworks. So there's acehubwales.com has got, they call it TRACE informed, so trauma and ACEs informed. So they call it TRACE informed, but they've got like a framework for organisations, not school specific. Trauma informed schools has got a school specific one. I think Thrive have probably got a school one. The Public Health Wales training that got rolled out came with a schools framework. So there are frameworks out there that have considered what does it mean to be a trauma-informed school. And there's lots of examples of trauma-informed schools out there who've already gone through the training program and they've completed, these audits and they've changed practice. I think on the ACES Hub website, there's a little film, I think it's Millbank in Cardiff, who are a trauma-informed school, and they've got the children talking on there about what that means on a day-to-day basis for them and what that looks like in the school. So it's about shifting and changing culture in terms of in the staff team, also in their relationships with parents and the openness and transparency with their parents, and then the day-to-day kind of approaches with the children. And it's things like the importance of every day a fresh start. I keep coming back to that, but it is massively significant for children with trauma. Calm spaces in the school, places children can go to just kind of calm down, and when they're starting to dysregulate, that key person. So I think in Millbank, each child gets to choose their adult in the school that they will go to if they need to speak to somebody, and that's, a given within the school. So it's having kind of systems in place where the staff feel supported and the children feel supported.
And possibly rewriting policy. I'm just thinking about some behaviour policies that might be completely at odds with this kind of approach. And so maybe a lot of reworking of those policies to make it work.
Yeah, absolutely. And a shift in thinking really as well, because especially around the challenging behaviour, we've still got some quite ingrained old school thinking. I'm saying all the wrong things, I shouldn't be saying this, but we've got some quite old fashioned traditional thinking still out there in schools about behaviour. and what we can't let them get away with, and we can't let them win, and they can't get their own way, and we can't just let it go. They shouldn't just be getting away with these sorts of things. And it is really outdated, but it still exists amongst teachers and support staff. So there's a culture shift as well. There was a primary school in Cardiff probably about 5 years ago where the head teacher was in quite a deprived part of Cardiff, and the head teacher decided that he was going to completely flip the school's approach to behaviour, to be a trauma-informed. And he, every member of staff had to be on board with things like the fresh start, the meet and greet, the, being available for children when they came and they needed to speak to someone, and all of those things. And it took quite a bit of work to make that culture shift, because there are still a lot of people who perceive the challenging behaviours as a choice. So, yeah, there's...
And as we're kind of heading towards a conclusion to this discussion, you've hinted at something, during this discussion. I'm thinking, let's just go there. Let's just ask this question, see where this one lands. You've made the point very strongly that there is a big problem here. I mean, I was blown away by the fact that Wales had significantly worse statistics for this stuff than the US. I mean, that's quite amazing. You've made a really good argument for doing this in schools, that this is going to do good stuff for kids.
Yeah.
I feel like there's a sort of elephant in the room, which I guess I could articulate by asking the question, beyond the sort of emotional availability, the doing a good thing by the kids thing, to what extent are we missing a whole other piece of the puzzle, which is more specialist care, perhaps some of them being in schools, that it's not just the teachers papering over perhaps some investment-related cracks. Go for it.
Talk about putting me on the spot. Well, look, it's the same as the poverty impact on outcomes in Wales, isn't it? We know that in the last 20 years, we've done nothing to improve the outcomes of our children living in poverty in Wales. And we've got the most deeply ingrained intergenerational poverty in the UK. And the outcomes for those children are starkly, lower than the rest of the population. And what's the answer to that? Does that lie in classroom practice? Does that lie in relationships? It's a much bigger societal problem. And so is this on so many levels. Because, if you look at, for example, it'd be really interesting. We won't know it for a number of years, but the children who are children now, who were children through COVID, to do an ACEs survey on them in 10, 15 years' time, because we know that during COVID, things like abuse, domestic violence, alcohol and substance misuse, mental health, parental separation, all of these things skyrocketed. They were already incredibly high, but they, went up to another level during COVID. The implications of that on our children, we're seeing it coming through in the early years particularly. The children coming through the early years at the moment are incredibly complex, many of them. And so there's so many strands linking into all of these elements. Some people would say poverty is at the heart of many of those issues. Not all, adverse childhood experiences don't just happen in deprived areas. Children are abused in wealthy families, as well. Absolutely, but things like living in poverty, substance misuse, etc., those figures tend to be higher where there's poverty, interrelated. But there's so many strands. I mean, it almost feels like an impossible mountain to climb. I would say that the work that started at the moment in Wales around community-focused schools links really closely to this, because that's a recognition that all of these services and strands involved in children's lives, and including like parent education opportunities and things like that, that, you know, all of this feeds into the well-being and the achievement of the children. And so actually we should bring it all together. And that's one road to go down, I think, that has real potential. But in order for that to be impactful, there has to be a complete shift in the way that all of these service areas are operating and are funded, because at the moment, you know, we just haven't got the services set up in that way. If you said, actually, we need a psychiatrist or a psychiatric nurse from CAMS based in every high school across Wales, the NHS would say we don't have the funds for that. Nor do we have the clinicians. They can't get people in post, but that's another matter. But, you know, there's lots of services that actually, if we were to fully move to that community-focused schools model, which I think could go a huge way to supporting communities, you know, out of these circumstances, it would need a complete shift in funding mechanisms.
And that, I think, might have to be a whole other episode all by itself. But thank you for indulging me with that horrible question. It's hard, isn't it? It's very hard.
Yeah.
Okay, let's move on to some short slots. So would you like to give us your something interesting or your something to try first? Give you a choice, since I asked you a nasty question a minute ago.
Let's do a something to try, because I'll make it related. I mentioned it earlier in the podcast, and I think it's a really useful strategy, even for, and I say even for, but like secondary teachers, because I mean as in it's a completely different type of environment, isn't it? But I've worked with secondary teachers who've used the wine model and have found it really impactful. I've known secondary and primary practitioners who have actually printed the little acronym on a card and stuck it on the back of their staff badge, so that when they're faced with a situation where somebody might be a little bit, you know, they're like, oh yeah, they're the phrases I've got to use again. I wonder if, you know, oh, I imagine that was really quite... But I would definitely say that the you know, I wonder, I imagine, I notice, and approaching children with empathy is a really useful strategy. The other thing I would say is there's an approach in the trauma-informed training called affect attunement, and it's the opposite of what we instinctively do. So when somebody is angry or upset, we try to be really super calm. Yeah, right. Now I can see that you're very upset and da-da-da. Actually, particularly with older learners, all that does is irritate them more and exacerbate the situation. So one of the things they talk about in trauma-informed training is actually meeting the emotion of the learner, meeting it appropriately, not as in raging with them. But, you know, if they're like really cross about something, I can see that you're really cross. I understand, you know, I can understand why that would make you really angry. You know, I wonder if we could do such and such to see how, but you're meeting them to show them that you really empathise with the feelings they're having and you're not belittling their feelings. And again, I've had anecdotal reports, particularly from secondary teachers, that have found that really impactful, and that it kind of almost takes the wind out of the students' sails, because they're almost a bit kind of taken aback with, oh.
Give us the name for that again.
Affect attunement.
God, that's a word I've never heard before.
Very nice. Okay.
Very interesting.
Wine and affect attunement. They are our two things.
And you gave us something really interesting that I've started listening to last time. So what's it this time? Something
Do you know,
interesting.
it's so funny because I did this last time, didn't I? I came in with no idea. I'd completely forgotten about the 2 questions, and I did the same this morning. So it's when you said before, I was like, oh, got to think of something interesting. I'm currently halfway through a book called Ultra Processed People.
Ah,
Have you heard of
yes.
it?
It's all over the place.
Have
isn't
you
it,
read
at the moment,
it?
that book? I haven't read it, no, but I've read about it.
So my sister-in-law brought it down, and she was like, I think you really enjoy this book. And I was like, all right, okay. I'm halfway through it. It's absolutely fascinating. I didn't know it was all over the place. I'm not very good on, like, I don't keep up to date with like the news or like articles. I'm rubbish with stuff. I'm a little kind of world. Usually got like Harry Potter on an audio like book or something. But yeah, so I'm reading this Ultra Processed People. It's really, really fascinating. The way he presents it is fantastic. He talks through all the research. He goes right back in time in history, and it's basically highlighting the fact that. Like obesity, not just obesity, but obesity and lots of other health issues that we're experiencing. If you think about the stats around like cancer now, is it like 1 in 2 of us or something we've gone up to? But, things like cancer, diabetes, heart disease, all of that, that actually the factor that's impacting on that is the number of processed ingredients in our food, not how much food or how lazy we are or anything like that. It's about the processedness of what we're eating, which is really fascinating. And one of the things with Grim, you see this thing called, is it Gower gum or xanthan gum? One of the gums that I've known for ages you have to avoid. So I often look for it and go, oh, not having that. But I didn't know why. Someone had said avoid it because they're not very nice. It explains in this book, when they grow bacteria in a petri dish, the like slime and gunk that the bacteria creates to stick to stuff, they extract that gunk off the bacteria and put it into the food to thicken it. Mm-hmm. Nice. Yeah. So the book's full of like interesting random facts like that. But yeah, I'm halfway through. I'm enjoying it.
Tell about the rest of the episode, but that should have come with the trigger warning.
It's grim, isn't it? It is grim.
This episode discusses trauma and bacterial slime. Avoid. Stick to wine.
Indeed.
The real stuff.
Oh, Dr. Anne Hodgson, you are as ever a legend. Thank you so much
No problem.
for coming in again and giving us another classic episode.
And we will be back in your ears in 2 weeks' time.
You've been listening to Emma and Tom Talk Teaching, a podcast about all things education, presented by Emma O'Dooher and Tom Breeze. The special guest this episode was Dr. Anne Hodgson from here at Cardiff Met, and thanks to Anne for taking part. Podcast artwork is by Beth Blandford and the music is by Cameron Stewart. The studio manager is Adrian Rapps. We're on X at Talk Teaching Pod if you want to come and say hello to us. We'll be back in a fortnight with something else interesting. Until then, take care and enjoy teaching.